My neighbor's tenant keeps waving at me. I think something is very wrong. Now, don't get me wrong. My neighbor Ray seems like a nice guy. He's this handsome man in his mid to late 40s. He's charismatic, bright, and very charming. If I were a few years younger, I might even say I have a little crush on him, though I'd never admit it. However, as of recently, I've been observing him exhibiting some questionable behavior. Trust me, I'm no stranger to unique habits, given I have a few of my own. But his are a little more disturbing. Let me give you some context. Ray has this spare bedroom in his basement. Instead of renting it out to make extra money, he offers up the room to homeless young women in our town free of charge. Now, to most people, this would appear to be a massive act of service done by a stand-up guy. But something about the whole situation is a little off. Before I start bashing Ray, I want to give him some credit. He had some normal hobbies that he kept up with. He loved to garden. He was constantly digging up his backyard, mulching it and tending to the various species of plants and trees that grew in a seemingly random pattern. This was normal enough, given a large majority of our community had taken up gardening as a hobby. He would even have some of the women he let stay in his house to help out. I had often seen them digging holes and watering plants under Ray's supervision. However, this would never last long, given that these ladies wouldn't stay longer than a month or two and I didn't see much of them. I remember being confused the first time I watched him ushering one lady into his home. Being the nosy neighbor I am, I had asked him who she was, assuming she was a family member of his who was passing through our tiny rural town, or maybe even a lover he was trying to keep discreet. But when Ray responded, he got all excited and childlike. "Oh, those are some homeless girls I've been taking care of. I love to look out for the homeless population in town. Wanted to make sure they have a safe place to sleep and a nice meal to eat each day." I thought it was a bit weird that he was only choosing young girls as tenants, but I figured there was a good reason for it. Perhaps he had a female friend or sibling who had been in a similar situation and was more sympathetic to that demographic. At the end of the day, it seemed like a wholesome, innocent contribution to society. At least that's how I tried to view it, despite the gnawing feeling in my gut and blaring sirens sounding in my head. All I knew was that each day, Ray would leave his house at approximately 7 in the morning after having his cup of joe on the porch and chirping a good morning to each passerby. Like clockwork, he'd return at around 5 in the evening, do some yard work, and withdraw back into his house. I usually wouldn't see much of him for the rest of the day. He must be quite a man of routine, I thought. Even so, there was still something about him that was off. Something in his eyes that wasn't quite right. Something very few people would take note of if they weren't looking closely enough. And on top of that, recently things started getting even weirder. The most recent occupant of my neighbor's downstairs bedroom was this blonde girl who looked no older than 18. Ray had ushered her into the house like all the rest, with one arm slung around her shoulder and a black jacket shielding most of her face from my view. From what I could see, she looked fairly well kept for someone who had supposedly been living on the streets. And what the hell was with the jacket? I mean, for God's sake, she was no celebrity, right? The following days, after Ray would leave, I heard some odd sounds coming from his house during all hours of the day. I work most days from home as an independent contractor, so I tend to keep an ear out for shenanigans going on in the neighborhood while most of the community is elsewhere. These noises included, but were not limited to, heavy metal music, banging on what sounded like pots and pans, occasional yelps like that of a small dog, and loud laughing or crying. It was a bit hard to tell. I assumed that Ray's current housemate just had some alternative interests. Again, I'm in no position to judge. Granted, I have my own unusual hobbies. Initially, I let it go. When Ray would return, All the noise would cease as if he had just walked in and turned the volume down on the whole household. I thought about bringing it up to him but decided against it. Something about the whole thing irked me, but there was no evidence of any wrongdoings on Ray's part. What more could I do besides sit idly by and watch it all unfold? That was until one night last week. I was up in my bedroom getting settled in for bed when I heard the softest, most muffled tapping noise. It came in increments. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, 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 tap. Pause. Tap, tap. At first, I simply ignored it. But after about 15 minutes, the tapping had grown louder and seemingly more urgent, coming in more frequent increments. I found myself searching for the source, during which time the noise had almost driven me to the brink of insanity. I had almost decided that it was an auditory hallucination, courtesy of spending most of my days in silence when my eyes fell upon the closed curtains of my large windowsill. Perhaps the tapping was coming from outside. I peeked through the curtains in an attempt to scan the surroundings of my home. I had discovered Ray's upstairs bathroom window faced my bedroom window after an unfortunate incident involving me undressing unbeknownst to my audience, Ray taking an innocent glance outside while brushing his teeth. I took a liking to keeping my curtains closed after that. It usually takes a moment for my eyes to adjust to the pitch darkness, given our town refuses to install street lights, and Ray's lights are usually out by 9 p.m. This time, however, I noticed Ray's upstairs bathroom light was on despite the time being around 10 o'clock. And there was a silhouette inside, facing me. The dark figure was far too small to belong to Ray, so I assumed it was his blonde occupant, the girl I had seen earlier. Did Ray know she was upstairs? I had never seen any of his tenants use the upstairs bathroom. What was even more odd were her gestures. She was waving her arms around her head like a lunatic. At first, I thought she might have had a blow dryer in her hand, or at least something she was using to style her hair. But upon closer inspection, I realized her hands were empty. These frantic gestures continued for a moment before the bathroom light turned off and the house went dark. A chill ran down my spine. The whole scene was perturbing. That night, I lay awake in bed attempting to rationalize what I had seen. I began to theorize. Perhaps she was a recovering addict and suffering from withdrawals. Or maybe she was trying to kill a fly. Yet I couldn't imagine what scenario would cause her to act so strange, and I couldn't shake that feeling that she was in some sort of danger. I decided to talk to Ray the following morning about what I had seen. I wanted to make sure he was aware of it in case there was something he knew that I didn't. Or maybe even something he could do to help with whatever was going on. "Good morning, Ray." I greeted him as I approached his front porch. He was sitting in the same old rickety rocking chair, sipping from his usual ceramic mug. "Well, good morning, Miss Lisa." Ray's face broke out into his famous, dazzling grin. "What can I do for you this fine morning?" "I was just wondering about that new tenant of yours. The blonde one, I mean. Who lives downstairs? I saw her in your upstairs bathroom last night and she seemed a bit agitated." The look on Ray's face changed for a moment so brief. If I had blinked, I would have missed it. His grin had vanished and his features were consumed by an expression so feverishly unhinged, he was almost unrecognizable. But just as quickly as his face had become the monstrosity I just described, it morphed back into a look of concern, arched brows, earnest eyes, and a subtle frown. I had subconsciously taken a few steps back, attempting to make sense of what I had just seen. "Oh geez, Miss Lisa. I can't apologize enough for the burden. I had no idea Danielle had bothered you last night. She must have been toying around in my medicine cabinet again. I'll have a talk with her and smooth everything over, I promise." I was still trying to process his sudden change in demeanor as I struggled to find a response. "Oh no, Ray, it was no bother at all. I just wanted to make sure she was okay is all." "Oh, don't you worry your blessed heart. She'll be fine. Just a case of night fever, I'm sure." And he gave me a smile so dazzling, it almost made me forget about the horrific face I had seen him make just moments prior. You know that feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when you know something is about to go horribly wrong? Like instead of butterflies in your stomach, it's moths or bees or something. That's precisely how I felt walking back to my house after my interaction with Ray. I spent the entire rest of the day glancing periodically outside my bedroom window, watching, waiting, for the inevitable disaster my gut had anticipated. But all I saw were the usual activities. Ray leaving the house at 7 a.m., the usual ruckus coming from his home upon his departure, and his prompt arrival at 5 in the evening. Before I knew it, the sun had gone down and Ray's house was once again dark and quiet. I had finally decided to close my curtain at around 9, ceasing my incessant stalking after hours of monitoring the house, when I noticed a figure at the window once more. The blonde tenant was back. Only this time she looked gangly, thin in a way I couldn't describe. Not glowing as she had been when I first laid eyes on her upon her arrival, but skeletal. Her skin was taut and pale and sheen with sweat. Her hands were even cupping her face, displaying a distressed gesture. I could only compare her face in the window that night to that one painting by Edward Munch. The Scream, I believe it's called. The only difference was her mouth was closed. Her eyes were wide. I could see the whites of them above her irises clear as day, despite our distance. The sheer look of her made my skin crawl. I waved my arms at her instinctively, but stopped myself. This was my first attempt at contact, and I knew I couldn't blow it. I had to be discreet in case Ray was watching. She began lifting her arms slowly, a stark contrast to the woman I saw frantically flaunting her arms around before, and I noticed something. I squinted, attempting to identify the small marks on her body I was seeing. They seemed to be lacerations of sorts around her wrists, near the bends of her forearms, and around her neck. I hadn't noticed them at first, but the closer I inspected her, the more concerned I grew. She was no longer the lively, panic-struck woman I had seen mere days ago. She now looked like a shell of herself covered from head to toe in gashes and what seemed to be defense wounds. I felt the panic bubbling inside of me. Something was very wrong here. I knew it before and I had known it then. I watched as she waved her arms back and forth robotically, as if it were being done mechanically. I was so overwhelmed with emotion that I shut the curtains abruptly. I couldn't bear to keep watching. I didn't sleep the whole night. I picked at my cuticles feverishly. I sweat through my sheets. I was losing my mind, perhaps. The thought of my neighbor, who I had previously considered a genuine friend, doing something so horrendous to these women was nauseating. The thought of being helpless in the matter made me feel even worse. What could I do? Call the police? I had no tangible evidence, nothing that could be proven in court at least. I was completely and utterly powerless. The days went by and I hadn't seen the sickly blonde woman by the window in a while. I checked consistently, every night, to no avail. I had even begun checking periodically during the day, just in case, to no avail. I had begun to believe I had imagined the whole damn thing after about a week of no sightings. That was, until last week. I had been mindlessly flipping through the channels on TV when a story on one of our few local news stations caught my eye. The broadcaster had mentioned a 22-year-old woman who had gone missing 2 weeks ago in the town just above ours, a recent graduate from Clemson University. An image of the woman appeared on the screen and I felt my stomach drop into my small intensities. The woman who appeared on screen was a healthier, fuller version of the woman in Ray's window. Blonde tan, dressed in an orange tank top and jean shorts with a wide smile and dazzling blue eyes. Nothing at all like the gray, ghastly girl I had seen the previous nights before, but still recognizable. I clutched my chest and gasped, instinctively attempting to avoid releasing a scream that would certainly wake up the entire neighborhood, including Ray himself. I knew I couldn't call the police without sufficient evidence. The cops in our town were clueless and, quite frankly, lazy. They would do very little with a tip about a lonely lady who claims to have seen a missing woman in her neighbor's house. They'd pay Ray a visit and ask him about it. There would be no warrant obtained. There's no probable cause. It would be my word against his. Better yet, Ray would know that I'm on to him, and God only knows what he would do with that information. After hours of seething in my own dread on my living room couch, drowning in my own sweat, biting my fingernails until there was nothing left to bite, and weighing the pros and cons of calling the police while developing an alternate course of action, I came up with nothing. Just this morning, after a sleepless night on my part, I saw him from my back porch, out in his backyard digging up holes in his garden with a rusty shovel. Gardening? I called over to him, attempting casual conversation as I gripped the handle of my coffee cup a tad too tightly. Yep, I just got these peach trees. Want to plant them for the upcoming season. It's the perfect time of year for them. His smile was too bright. He was practically shaking with excitement, and he continued shoveling loads of earth onto the ground beside the hole. I remember thinking the hole had been a bit too big for a seed. It was so large, I reckon I could have easily fit inside of it. I had to hold myself to keep from trembling. Sure is, I replied as I sipped my coffee shakily and turned to head back inside before I heard Ray call out to me. He looked up at me. No, look is not the right word. He saw into me, stared into my psyche with black, soulless eyes. It was a knowing look, one that said, "I know that you know." I held my breath, preparing myself for the words that would exit his mouth. But all he had said was, "Have a great day, hun." And then he went back to digging. I think I'm almost out of time. I can see myself locked in Ray's bathroom, waving frantically to my vacant house just as Emery did. Except this time, there will be no one there to wave back.